The fields around the quiet village of Fricourt saw the blood of Yorkshire spent dearly on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. This week we returned to Picardy, and we walked the lanes across those vast open landscapes of the Somme battlefields. On a beautiful summer's morning in 1916, one writer described this as a sunlit picture of hell. So let's return to those lanes and discover the history of Fricourt. It's high summer on the Somme, and I'm standing in a valley between the villages of Bécourt and Bécourt-d'El, close to the town of Albert, the main hub on the Somme battlefields in 1916, the town where the majority of soldiers who came to the Somme passed through, either going to the trenches or coming out. Dominated by the basilica, the church, with its leaning statue of the Virgin Mary with her arms outstretched, holding the infant Jesus, the leaning Virgin or the Golden Virgin, it was a familiar landmark on the Somme in 1916. This valley was behind our lines, and to my left are some trees. This time of year there's a little birdsong. Birdsong period has ended, but there are crows in the trees and a few pigeons making their way across the valley. And on the far side there are some banks, and into those banks in 1916 were dug guns, first field guns supporting the attack on the villages in this sector on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and later heavy artillery. And there are some photographs of Australian siege gunners with 9.2-inch howitzers firing their guns in support of the Australians in the attack at Pozieres in July of 1916. But in front of me is a long, narrow cemetery, Norfolk Cemetery, and we'll open the gate and go in. Back on the Somme this week, we're going to be walking the ground up and into the village of Fricourt, which was the part of the line on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, where the line curved and went roughly east towards the tail end of the Somme front from a British perspective, the villages of Mametz and Montauban. In my book, Walking the Somme, I call this the Yorkshire Walk because this ground, certainly on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, involved almost every regiment recruited in Yorkshire, from the Yorkshire Regiment itself, the Green Howards, to the East Yorkshire Regiment, the West Yorkshire Regiment, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, and also the Duke of Wellington's, the Duke of Boots, the West Riding Regiment, who were close by as part of this attack as well. But it's Norfolk Cemetery where we start. The cemetery began by the 1st Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment in August of 1915, the summer of 1915, 105 years ago this month. And they made their burials here after serving in the line taking over this sector from the French. It's quite likely that there were originally some French burials here as well. The cemetery remained in use until the summer of 1916, so it lasted for about a year, and there was around 150 or so burials here by the time it was closed. And then after the war, a decision was made to make this cemetery permanent, and 268 burials were moved in from the Fricourt area, the neighbouring village and the battlefields surrounding it, to be buried here. The vast majority of those graves that were moved in were of soldiers whose identity were not known. So when you go into the plot towards the rear of the cemetery, which is where these moved in graves are located, you'll find that most men there are unknown soldiers. There are also Commonwealth soldiers buried here. There are 9 Australians, 3 South Africans, 2 Canadians, a New Zealander and an Indian soldier, a Muslim soldier buried slightly separately from the other graves in that plot. There's quite a lot of gunners here despite the name Norfolk Cemetery, because as I mentioned, this was an area, this valley, this bit of dead ground which could not be seen from the German trenches, was a safe place to move about and a safe place to have your artillery. And in the winter months you can see in the banks beyond the cemetery towards the village of Fricourt slight indentations in those banks where some of these gun positions were located. The gunners, of course, are never in the front line except with observer teams, but their role in the war, which was a war of the guns, is an important part of our understanding of the Great War. Most men in the war were killed or wounded not by machine guns or bayonets, but by shell fire. So the artillery really were the king and queen of the battlefields throughout the 4 years of the Great War. One of the first graves that I go to look at every time I visit this cemetery is just up on the left along the boundary wall of the cemetery. Second Lieutenant Walfrid Reeve Cloutman, who died here on the 21st of August 1915, aged 24. He'd been an engineering and mining student at the University of London before the war and had gone off to Australia and then to the Malay States, where he was mining on the outbreak of war in 1914. He returned to England and was commissioned in the Royal Engineers, and given his mining background, he became one of the early officers in the tunnelling companies of the Royal Engineers. His unit, the 178th Tunnelling Company, operated at a position in front of the village of Fricourt called the tambour, the drum, and they were working in the mining galleries beneath those positions a year before the Battle of the Somme even began. One of the great dangers that miners faced, whether that was working in a civilian coal mine beneath the Yorkshire coalfields or in tunnels beneath the village of Fricourt on the Somme, was carbon monoxide, the unseen, unsmelt killer that could easily build up in the tunnels and kill the sappers, kill the miners, kill the tunnellers that were working on those positions. So because you couldn't smell it, they took birds, canaries and mice in cages down into the tunnels with them, and if you saw them suddenly keel over in their cage or fall off their perch, you knew that the gas was present and you were in danger. One of the issues in using these small animals in this way, particularly with the canaries, is that the men actually became attached to them and wouldn't take them down into the tunnels, fearing that they would get killed. So there were quite a few incidents beneath the Western Front in which tunnellers were overcome by fumes, and this is what led to the death of Second Lieutenant Cloutman in August of 1915. His tunnelling company, working on the tambour position, encountered this problem, and men in his section began to collapse, and one of his sergeants was particularly badly affected. So he picked him up and put him on his back and began to climb the ladders to get up the shaft, which was about 45 feet beneath the surface, to try and get him up to safety. Unfortunately for Walfrid Cloutman, he was much more overcome by the fumes than he realised, and as he got to the top, he too collapsed and died shortly afterwards from the effects of carbon monoxide poisoning. He was recommended for a Victoria Cross for his bravery here, but for whatever reason that didn't go through. And as it was a posthumous act of gallantry, the only other recommendation he could receive was a posthumous mention in dispatches, which eventually appeared in the London Gazette. Bravery obviously ran in the Cloutman family because his brother Brett became the last British soldier to be awarded the Victoria Cross on the Western Front on the 6th of November 1918, when also serving in the Royal Engineers, he swam the Somme Canal and captured a bridge that had been wired up for demolition by the Germans, enabling the advance to continue. When he died in the 1970s, he requested that his ashes be scattered on his brother's grave, so the two of them lie here together. As we walk further into the cemetery, we encounter another important grave here, that of Major Stuart Walter Ladune Shand, VC. He was born in Ceylon in 1879 into a family that had made a fortune out of Ceylon tea plantations. He was educated at Dulwich College and at the time of the Boer War was working banking in London. He'd initially served with the London Scottish and then volunteered for the Imperial Yeomanry and served in the Boer War, being awarded the Queen South Africa Medal. At the time of the Great War, he was back in Ceylon working in the family business, but volunteered and returned to Britain and was given a commission in the 10th Battalion, the Yorkshire Regiment, the Green Howards. He fought with them in the Battle of Loos only a few weeks after landing in France, was wounded in March of 1916, and on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, his battalion was in one of the follow-up waves, but the ground in which they were attempting to advance from was swept by German machine gun fire. The attack at Fricourt, which they were a part of, had gone disastrously wrong. The Germans had survived despite the explosion of mines, despite the bombardment. The ground favoured their defence, and the ground over which Ladune Shand and his men were attempting to advance was falling prey to this heavy German machine gun fire, and his men were falling all around him. Hid himself, he attempted to encourage his men forward, and for his bravery in that incident, which was witnessed by one of the veterans that I knew, Harry Fellows, who remember seeing Ladun Shan being taken away on a stretcher, still encouraging his men despite grievously wounded. But it would result in the awards, the bravery that he clearly demonstrated that day, it would result in the awards of a posthumous Victoria Cross. And his citation reads as follows: "For most conspicuous bravery, when his company attempted to climb over the parapet to attack the enemy's trenches, they were met by very fierce machine gun fire, which temporarily stopped their progress. Major Ladun Shan immediately leapt on the parapet, helped the men over it, and encouraged them in every way until he fell mortally wounded. Even then, he insisted on being propped up in the trench and went on encouraging the non-commissioned officers and men until he died." Ladun Shan became one of 9 men awarded the Victoria Cross for bravery on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Continuing further along this row, we come to the far end of the cemetery, and there is a small plot here of officers of the 9th Battalion King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry who died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, including their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Lynch. I mentioned their story in a previous Old Frontline podcasts on the annual commemoration of the Battle of the Somme. This was a group of men who, like Ladun Shan, had fought in the battle before. They'd fought in the Battle of Lewes. They were part of the same division as the 10th Green Howards, the 10th Yorkshire Regiment, in which Ladun Shan had served. And like him, after the Battle of Lewes, they'd moved down to the Somme when it was a quiet sector in the months leading up to the battle itself. On the eve of the battle, that assembled behind the lines, the final preparations for the battalion for its attack were being made, and the officers got together in the building that served as the officers' mess. They stood there looking at each other. They knew the offensive was coming, and one of the men proposed a toast to the commanding officer, Colonel Lynch, whose grave we're standing at now. Lynch had been awarded the Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, for bravery at Lewes, so there's no doubting that he was a good soldier. But for a reason that isn't entirely clear, he wasn't a very popular officer within the battalion. And we know this from a chap called Spicer, who wrote a series of letters that were published in the 1970s, and he relates this story. So being an unpopular officer, there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm amongst the other officers present to toast Lieutenant Colonel Lynch. So one man stepped forward, who's buried here, Captain Gordon Haswell, and he proposed a slightly different toast. "Gentlemen, I give you the toast of the King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry, and in particular the 9th Battalion of that regiment. Gentlemen, when the barrage lifts." And this was a reference to the moment at 0 hour, 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July, when the British bombardment of the German trenches at Fricourt would cease, would lift, the whistles would blow, and the battalion would go into action. The majority of the officers who stood there and witnessed that and toasted, along with Haswell, were killed or wounded on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Haswell himself, Colonel Lynch, most of the company commanders, and almost all of the platoon commanders. These were men who led from the front, so when the machine guns began to blaze, they were the first to fall. And Spicer, who related that story, who immortalised that story in his book, every year on the anniversary of the Battle of the Somme until his death, he put a little entry in a national newspaper with a single line: "When the barrage lifts." We'll leave the cemetery via the rear access gate and walk up onto the road and continue in our journey along the valley here towards the village of Bécourt. Bécourt is only a tiny village, only a handful of houses even today, and it wasn't really much more than a hamlet in 1916, dominated by a small chateau. The chateau was in the hands of the de Valicourt family, and as we come up to the far end of this road, where it meets some trees and a track goes off to the right, which we'll take, there is a little memorial cross here to Joseph de Valicourt, the son of the family that lived in the chateau. He was an officer, a lieutenant in the French artillery, and was killed in the fighting on the Chemin des Dames in 1917. He has no known grave, and this really is his only memorial. The chateau in which his parents had lived was taken over by the French army in the early phase of the war, and when British troops arrived here in 1915, they used it too. brigades had advanced headquarters here. There was also a medical facility. The Royal Army Medical Corps established an advanced dressing station here. So wounded being brought back from the battlefield, the frontline trenches in the quiet sector, were brought here for treatment and then passed down the evacuation chain to the casualty clearing stations beyond the town of Albert, which wasn't that far away. On the first day of the Somme, it became a main casualty reception area for the wounded coming back from the attacks around Fricourt. And there was a small cemetery in the grounds of Becourt Chateau. There's a wartime photograph of it, which I'll put on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk. And this shows not a particularly big cemetery, a few dozen graves, which appear to have been moved to Becourt Military Cemetery after the war. So when we visit battlefields like this, we can get an insight into the infrastructure, really, of the battlefield as it was in 1916. The cemetery, where we started from, was quite some way behind our lines in a bit of dead ground that could not be seen from the enemy trenches, so it was safe to move around, safe to bury the dead, and safe to have gun positions there as well. Moving up to the chateau, again, this was protected by the woodland, protected by the folds of ground, so you could have headquarters here, medical facilities, and again a cemetery to bury the dead from the fighting in your area. And then the next phase of our walk will take us into the area where the trench system began. The track that we're going to use was a track that existed in 1916 and would have been used by units as they moved up through Becourt to get into those trenches. As they got to the slopes that we're about to walk onto, that's where the communication trenches that took them up to the forward area of the battlefield began. So leaving Joseph de Valicourt's cross, we'll continue along the track and we'll follow it gradually uphill. The first part of the track is almost sunken. There are banks either side of it, and it is one of those parts of the Somme battlefields where you can let your mind race away and think of the past, think of the events that unfolded here in 1916. You can imagine on a dark night a ration party walking up this track with the front lines ahead, about to enter the communication trenches and take that food, the post, whatever, up towards their comrades in the front line trenches. And as we come up onto the rise, we begin to see how open this part of the battlefield is. There are spectacular views on this part of the walk, and we are literally walking in the footsteps of the men whose graves that we've seen in Norfolk Cemetery. So Captain Ledun Charn and his brave act of gallantry on the first day of the Battle of the Somme took place in the fields just on our right. The 10th Green Howards, in one of those follow-up waves for the assault here, assembled in the positions in this ground and were swept by that German machine gun fire from the village of Fricourt, which we can see ahead of us. The 9th King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel Lynch's battalion, when the barrage lifts, well, that lifted for them in the fields just across to our right. And in the distance beyond where they attacked, we can see the village of La Boisselle and the Lochnagar mine crater, which will feature in a future Old Frontline podcast. This has always been a favourite part of the battlefield for me to walk, because I think as you come up over here, you can see the ground here. You can see the effect that the ground had on the fighting that took place here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. This ground is totally open. There is no cover whatsoever. So if the defenders of the ground in which you're attacking, in this case the positions around the village of Fricourt, have survived your preliminary bombardment, which the Germans had, as soon as you emerged from your positions in what was then broad daylight at 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July 1916, you are going to be very vulnerable to enemy machine gun fire, and that is exactly what happens here. The ground over which you're now walking was swept by machine gun fire from multiple directions. Effectively, they laid down a machine gun barrage, and as men tried to move forward, they fell. In many units, like Ledun Charn's 10th Green Howards, they suffered probably almost as many casualties before they even reached their own front line as they did in crossing no man's land. So this attack here for men from two different divisions, the 21st Division and the 17th Northern Division, two formations that included all these different regiments from Yorkshire, suffered greatly as they attempted to move across this open ground. The track continues to where it reaches a fork, and on this fork there is a single tree, and we'll stop here. This tree, when we look at the maps, and now of course we can use Linesman, the Great War digital product, which using GPS referenced trench maps, we can map our position exactly on the old battlefield. And when we look at that standing here, we can see quite clearly that we are now on the British front line. This is where, on the 1st of July 1916, at 7:30 in the morning, the whistles blew and the men from these different Yorkshire regiments went over the top. To our right, advancing down towards the village of Fricourt, and over to our left, across the open ground, the valley, leading up to the neighbouring division's attack in the ground around La Boisselle. That was where the men of the Tyneside brigades, the Tyneside Scottish and the Tyneside Irish, and that brigade of the 15th and 16th Royal Scots, the 11th Suffolks, the Cambridgeshires, and the 10th Lincolns, the Grimsby Chums, made their advance. But as I say, that's a story for another day. Where we are here in this tree, which you can see for quite some distance around, in fact, whenever I'm here on a battlefield tour, sitting on the coach, and as we're driving around this part of the battlefield, I always look up and keep a little eye out on this tree. It's almost like a little talisman. I know where I am when I see this tree, and I know where the front line is, and it's good to point out to people from a distance so you can show where the advance began from. But we can see for quite some distance here, we can see how the village of Fricourt, a very large village, lies ahead of us. There's a bit of scrub land beyond the small military cemetery, which we're going to walk to. That's Fricourt Military Cemetery. The scrub land is the tambour, the drum, and that's where the mining operations had taken place, both before and on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Lieutenant Cloutman, whose grave we saw in Norfolk Cemetery, that's where the incident that led to his death took place. The trenches here swung around the village of Fricourt, and over to our right we can see some high grounds. And when we see high ground on the Somme, normally it's in possession of the Germans, but this was actually behind the British front line. And it's on that high ground that Siegfried Sassoon, the war poet, was in reserve on the first day of the Battle of the Somme with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. He sat there and looked down on the village of Fricourt and watched the attack here by these different Yorkshire regiments and described it as a sunlit picture of hell. That high ground continues to swing around, and we can see a wooded area just beyond. That is the Bois Français, French wood, and that is where the front lines converged on the wooded area. And again, there was a lot of mining activity up there. There are mine craters in those woods. Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves, another one of the war poets, spent a lot of time up there in the lead up to the Battle of the Somme. And again, that will be an area that will walk another day on the old front line. But it's very easy to stop and stand at this spot with a trench map, with some memoirs, and look out across this true texture of the Somme landscape and be engrossed here for hours and hours. But we'll continue with our walk, and we'll walk downhill. On this next stretch of the walk, back in the 1980s, there used to be a little brick building down here, and alongside it the remains of a British Army General Service wagon. How that ended up in these fields we can only but imagine, but sadly there's no trace of it today. I'm pleased to say that I did photograph it, and I'll put a photograph of that again on the podcast website. As we walk this next stretch of ground, of course, we are crossing the old no man's land. And this is where, of course, a lot of that fire was brought to bear by the Germans. In this case, the defenders of Fricourt, the 111th Reserve Infantry Regiment, laid down terrific fire, both from their machine guns and then called up their artillery assets, turning this into what one soldier described as the blood-red ribbon of no man's land. Further down, we'll see a little track going off to our right, a little path, and that'll lead us to Fricourt New Military Cemetery. As we walk in through the gates of Fricourt New Military Cemetery, we see immediately that this is a burial ground dominated by two regiments. We can see the rocking horse badge of the West Yorkshire Regiment and the badge of the East Yorkshire Regiments. Of the 210 burials here, 159 of them are from the 10th West Yorks and 38 from the 7th East Yorks. They were two battalions that had advanced down the slopes over which you've just walked, and as you come into the cemetery and look to your right back towards that single tree, you are looking at the ground over which these men attempted to advance on the first day of the Somme. The 10th West Yorks, the initial elements of them, had actually crossed through this ground and got into the area beyond the tambour, but then the bulk of the battalion had moved in a follow-up attack with their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Dixon, and his adjutant by his side, Captain Sharn, and as they'd moved down that open ground, they had become easy prey to the German defenders. And Colonel Dixon and Captain Sharn are both buried here. Colonel Dixon originally served with the South Lancashire Regiment, and that's the badge that's seen on his headstone. So this then is perhaps one of the best examples of a comrade cemetery, of men who had enlisted together, had trained together, had crossed to France together, gone into the trenches for the first time together, and fought in their first big actions together at Loos and here on the Somme, fought side by side, died side by side, and are now buried side by side. And when we walk along the graves and the rows that are here, we get a good insight into the men that served from the different parts of Yorkshire in these two battalions. I always start a visit here at the grave of Albert Barker from Hull. He was killed with the 7th East Yorks, and when you look at the inscription on his grave, you see that he was 16 years old. He's one of the youngest soldiers to die on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. When I think back to the 1970s, long before I ever got a chance to visit these battlefields, I used to read a modelling and wargaming magazine called Battle, and every edition had an article in which the author visited a battlefield somewhere in Europe. And one of the editions was about the Somme. And I'd grown up on my grandmother's stories of her brother on the Somme, of her witnessing the chalk-smothered wounded coming back to the military hospitals in Colchester, where she lived as a young girl at that time. I knew that my great-uncle had been wounded on the first day of the Somme and another had been killed in the battle. It was something that, just like Ypres, was as familiar to me as anything else. And in that article, that probably the very first article I ever read about the battlefields of the Somme, was a photograph of Private Albert Barker's grave. The author remarked upon the fact that he was only 16, and 16 to me in the 1970s as a young child seemed a long way off, but I vowed somehow one day that I would visit that grave. And in 1983, I walked here with my father that summer, not long after my 16th birthday, and stood here for the first time at Albert Barker's grave. That was a long time ago now, but his name is something that will always link me back to this place on the old front line. A couple of rows across from the grave of Albert Barker is that of Lieutenant Alfred Victor Ratcliffe. He was born in Kent in 1887 and was educated at Dulwich College, just like Ladoun Chan, although they were there about a decade apart, so they weren't contemporaries, and as far as I'm aware, they didn't know each other. He went on to study at Cambridge, and at Cambridge he met Rupert Brooke and developed a great love of poetry, and had some verse published even before the outbreak of the war, and he is one of the lesser-known Great War poets. On the outbreak of war, he was at the Inner Temple and was a trainee barrister, but got a commission in the West Yorkshire Regiment and served with the 10th Battalion in northern France and then here in the Battle of the Somme. His poetry is not like Robert Graves or Siegfried Sassoon or Wilfred Owen. He was killed really before I suspect he had a chance to write about the war. The poems that he wrote from the trenches were very much influenced by the sort of early work that Rupert Brooke put out. And when you look at men like Brooke and you look at men like Ratcliffe, you wonder if they had served for some time before they were killed, what sort of poetry would they have written about the Great War? How would it have been different to the verse that they left behind? While Owen was consumed by the war, he served. He was able to draw on his experiences to write poetry, and neither Brooke nor Ratcliffe were able to do that. So even just from a poetry point of view, they're both what-ifs, and when we stand at the grave of Ratcliffe, we wonder what sort of verse he would have produced had he survived the Battle of the Somme, had he survived the Great War, what would have been his legacy. But to get a sense of the sort of verse that he did write, here's a couple of his poems, both of which were written in the trenches. This is Optimism. At last there'll dawn the last of the long year that seemed to dream no end, whose every dawn but turned the world more drear, and slew some hope or led away some friend. Or be you dark or buffeting or blind, we care not day, but leave not death behind. June Song was written in June of 1916, only a few weeks before he was killed here at Fricourt. It's a love poem. It's sweet to love, very sweet, but then, God knows, the thorn climbs swift to tear the hand that loves the rose. But if the heart's dear blood shall touch the gathering flower, it will make a redder rose, a rosier hour. And here in the fields at Fricourt, as he fell amongst the men that he'd served with since the very beginning of the war, I guess this was their rosier hour that ended in tragedy. Returning via the grass path across the fields, Where it meets the track, we here turn right and get a good view from this location across the fields towards the scrubland of the Triple Tambor mines, where the mine craters are located. We're going to come back to those another day on the old front line, so we'll continue here on and into the village of Fricourt. Fricourt was in ruins on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. It wasn't captured on the 1st of July. The Germans held the attacks back. So from Fricourt north, there was very little success that day. Beyond Fricourt, the villages of Mametz and Montauban were both captured, and eventually the village was captured a few days later. Fighting swept across this ground again in both March and then the summer of 1918, so nothing really remained of Fricourt come the end of the war, and it became part of that devastated zone, the Zone Rouge, in the post-war period. So everything that we see here was rebuilt from the 1920s onwards. Where we meet the main road, we turn left and walk north out of Fricourt. A little bit further up on the right-hand side is a steep bank with a hedgerow, and behind that is Fricourt German Cemetery. We'll walk up the steps and through the gate and go on in. Fricourt German Cemetery contains the remains of over 17,000 German soldiers. Just over 5,000 of these are buried here in the graves that we can see ahead of us. There are black crosses here, which more in just a moment. But the vast majority, over 11,000, in fact nearly 12,000, are buried in mass graves, communal graves, Kameradengrab and comrades' graves at the rear of the cemetery. When we look at the Somme battlefields in 1916, before the battle began, every village behind the German lines had a German war cemetery. Fricourt had one. The unit that defended this, the 111th Reserve Infantry Regiments, their cemetery was not here at Fricourt, it was in the village of Le Sars, and in fact there is a remnant of their cemetery with their regimental memorial tucked behind some farm buildings in Le Sars, which survives to this day. Many of these German cemeteries were either damaged or completely destroyed in the Battle of the Somme, and that was true right across the Western Front and the different battles that took place. But what it meant was that here on the Somme battlefields, many German cemeteries just simply ceased to exist. What happened in the post-war world is the Germans were given a chance to recover some of their dead, and a permanent cemetery was made on this site in 1920 by the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsversorger, the VDK, the German War Graves Commission. And in the years that followed, German burials from the cemeteries of the villages around the Somme were moved in here. Some graves, for example, I know were moved in from the village of Miramont. I had an old friend, Klaus, whose grandfather had been once buried there, who he believed had been moved here in the post-war period as an unknown German soldier, because he had a photograph of his grandfather's grave with two others. Those two were marked graves in this cemetery, and the one in the middle between them was an unknown German soldier, so he adopted that and was pretty sure that it was his grandfather. So the graves were moved in from a wide period, and they cover quite a big cross-section of the war. There's something like 1,000 graves here, for example, from men killed in the fighting on the Somme in 1914. The vast majority, of course, are 1916 casualties, with quite a few from the spring of 1918, the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle, as the Germans swept through this area again. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, was once buried here. He was originally buried at the Bertangles in the communal cemetery, but his grave was moved here in the 1920s, and then in 1925 he was moved again from here to the Invalidenstrasse cemetery in Berlin, where a plaque still marks the site of his grave, although his body was moved to the family burial plot many, many years later. The cemetery that we see today here at Fricourt is not the original cemetery. This is not how it was originally laid out. When we look at the black crosses that are here, we see that there are two names, front and back. And this leads people to believe that the men who are buried here in these graves are buried together, four to a grave. But the reality is they're all buried individually. And once upon a time there were crosses on all of these graves, including the Jewish graves, which we now see are marked by a grey stone. In the austerity following the Second World War, the VDK, the German War Graves Commission, decided to remove all of the individual grave markers and replace them with collective ones that commemorate more than one soldier, and this saved them a lot of money. Many of the men buried in the Kameradengrab and the comrades' graves at the rear of the cemetery were originally buried up to the 1950s in individual graves in other German cemeteries, which were then closed at that time and moved into mass graves like this. That happened here on the Somme in multiple cemeteries, and more famously to most people at Langemark up in Flanders, where cemeteries in Belgium were closed and men moved into the mass grave there. So this was common practice and was a result really of the outcome of the Second World War rather than the First. I came here in the late summer of 1983, and when you went to the back of the mass grave, there was nothing on them to say who was buried there, and it was only then at that time, so 30 years nearly after that grave had been established, that finally the German War Graves Commission put up plaques listing the names of the men buried there. In many respects, when we look at the commemoration of the Great War, the Germans are the missing person at the table. It's almost as if their dead somehow don't matter, but when we stand here amongst these thousands of burials of German soldiers, they do matter. This was our enemy in 1916. These are the men that our troops, the regiments of the British Army that we've discussed, were fighting. But the veterans that I interviewed back in the 1980s had a great respect for the German soldier in the Great War. They knew that they shared the same privations, the problems that they had. They saw them fight honourably as much as you could fight with honour on the battlefields of the Great War, and they respected them. And standing here, we respect them too. German cemeteries always seem very sad places to the average British visitor. There's very little personalisation here. There are no inscriptions on graves, no details about the men. We don't even know what parts of Germany these men came from. There's nothing in the register to tell us that. But they all had their stories. They left behind families. They had hopes and fears, dreams and ambitions. And just as we stand in a British war cemetery and we think of that with the men buried there, we should think of that here too, of old Fritz on the other side of the wire, lying here in perpetuity, and this cemetery as much of a beacon to the old front line as any of those that we've visited during the course of this walk. And as we close the gates and leave the cemetery behind, perhaps we think of the song that German soldiers sung at the graves of their fallen friends. I had a comrade. Ich hatte einen Kameraden, einen besseren findest du nicht. I once had a comrade, you will find no better. It's that part of the podcast where we look at an object connected to the Great War. And I know we haven't done this for a few weeks, and that's simply because I moved home, so the whole archive was boxed up, ready for the move, and gradually I'm unpacking it, so hopefully we'll start doing this again on a regular basis. And what I've got in front of me today is a little booklet of postcards. It's a little green-covered booklet. It says in French, La Somme dévastée, the devastated region of the Somme, and in big capital letters, Fricourt. It's a little collection of photographs of the village of Fricourt taken in around 1919, so showing what the village was like, or what was left of the village, just after the end of the war. And it's one of a number of these sort of booklets that were published in that post-war period, because the first visitors began to arrive on the battlefields within a few months after the end of the war, and local entrepreneurs began to realise that there was a commercial market here for souvenirs, whether that was postcards like this or trench art or all sorts of things were sold to the visitors in that interwar period. When I look at the images that are in this booklet, and I'll put some of them up on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, they show a village pretty much destroyed by the war. Overgrown fields, shattered trees, the odd wall standing here or there, nothing that you could actually say constituted an actual building. And then pictures of the barrack huts, the provisional housing that was put up by the French government, so that when people did return, as they did in the months after the war, they actually did have somewhere to live. These are fairly primitive things, as you'll see from the photographs. A few of them show some of the locals standing outside these buildings, and that life that they had in those years until the houses were rebuilt, which in most Somme villages was sometime in 1922, 23. It was a primitive life. They just lived in these wooden huts with a big pot boiler stove to keep them warm, salvage what they could, try to reclaim some of the land. Farming was then very, very difficult. So it was an odd sort of life, probably something that we could feel a bit of a kinship to, considering the odd year that we've all had in 2020. But the images do give you an idea of what these landscapes looked like in that immediate post-war period, that aftermath period following the Great War. And booklets like these and postcards like these, often referred to as war damage by postcard dealers, were usually fairly easy to acquire. Certainly back in the 1980s, you could buy boxes of them just for pennies because no one really wanted them. But like anything to do with the Great War, these things are now popular, and some are more rare than others and are increasingly difficult to find when you look around. But they give, as I say, this fascinating, fantastic insight into that post-war world. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Do take time to subscribe to us via your favourite podcast service. Tell us what you think using the hashtag OldFrontLine. You can follow me on Twitter at Sommecore, and the podcast has its own Twitter feed now at OldFrontLinePod. And have a look at the podcast websites oldfrontline.co.uk. Until we meet again, along the Old Front Line.